Chappelle, like Dave Chappelle, Robert.
A while back, the actor Will Smith wanted to do stand-up comedy. Before that event, he therefore decided he would get advice from Dave Chappelle on how to go about it. The words of advice that Dave Chappelle gave to Will Smith have stuck to me to this day. Dave Chappelle told Will Smith that when you're standing in front of people and you want to be interesting, you do not need to be funny throughout. However, you need to be interesting. Those were the words that were going through my mind as I set off on the engaging on humor path. Back in July 2020, at SEMA Toastmasters, I delivered my icebreaker. And the title of that icebreaker was like Dave Chappelle. And the purpose that I expressed in that speech was that at the end of the engaging with humor, I wanted to be like him in several qualities that made him an interesting speaker. This evening, I would like to remind you of those qualities and also tell you about how going through the engaging humor path has helped me grow in those three different qualities. Let us start with the first one. Dave Chappelle is an amazing storyteller. He might stand in front of an audience and it doesn't always have to be funny. However, the audience is always captivated with what he says. I remember watching a video of his on YouTube a few weeks ago. In that video, he was narrating how Comedy Central, the TV channel, had hoodwinked him out of his TV show. You see, back in the days, Dave Chappelle had a comedy skit TV show. However, over time, his relationship and between him and Comedy Central soured, and they ended up parting ways. When they parted ways, Dave Chappelle realized that, first of all, he will never get any royalties from the replays of his show. And second, he realized that he would never be able to create a similar show to the one that he had at Comedy Central. When he was narrating that story, he was quite hurt and he was expressing the deep hurt that he had gone through from the Comedy Central. However, the audience, even though he was not telling jokes, the audience was hanging at every word he said. They were enthralled by his narration. When I think of stories that he narrates like this, I wondered how I would be able to do this. Through the engaging with humor path, I learned how to tell stories. More specifically, I learned how to put my stories into the proper story structure. You see, a story has 6 parts. There is the first part, which is the setup. There you are introduced to the characters and the setting of the story. Then you have the inciting incident. This is what sets the story in motion. You then have the progressive complication. This is where things start to escalate and the conflict in the story increases. Then you have insight. This is where the protagonist learns some information on how to deal with the conflict they are facing. Then you have the climax. This is where the story reaches its peak and everything comes to an end ahead. And finally, the resolution, where the conflict is resolved at the end of the story. Through consistently applying this structure to the different stories that I told in the engaging with humor path, I learned how to effectively use it. And I also learned that by relying on this structure, I can be assured whenever I'm telling a story or giving an illustration or telling an anecdote, I'm able to engage the audience and keep the audience's attention from the beginning to the very end. The next quality of Dave Chappelle that I would like to have so that I can become an interesting speaker is his ability to talk about important matters. Dave Chappelle is always talking about hot button topics, but the thing that stands out the most for me is that he receives little to no backlash. Let me give you the example of during the Trump and Hillary election in 2017 and 2018. At that time, the supporters of these two individuals were quite violent towards each other. That violence filled the internet, it filled the airwaves. And even here in Kenya, where we are so far away from them, we could also sense that violence between the people who supported Trump and the people who supported Hillary. After the election, Dave Chappelle talked about how it felt for him to vote. He was a Hillary supporter, and he said that as he was lining up to cast his vote, he felt bad because of that whole negative environment that surrounded that election. He wished of the days of Obama where everything was positive and he was filled with hope as he was casting his ballot. After that show, he faced some backlash, but not that much. I thought of how I myself would like to talk about important things that are to me without getting that backlash from the audience. And in the course of delivering my projects in the Engaging with Humor, I learned how. I learned it is by making these things personal. Let me give you the example of gender roles in the house. When you get married, or if you are married right now, who in your house is meant to cook? This subject attracts a diversity of views. People think very different about how people should go about it. If I was to tackle this topic, if like I will do right now, I will take it from my own experience with my wife. You see, in our house, I'm the better cook. Do not tell her. However, over the years of being married, I have learned that we are happier if my wife cooks and if I eat whatever she cooks. I might not eat gourmet food in my house, but in my house, we are happy. You see, by putting it in a personal way like that, it is less likely to offend people. However, if I was to generalize it and speak in a pontificating manner, it will create a lot of offense, and therefore it will close the dialogue that might come from talking about those matters. The next way that I would like to be like Dave Chappelle is in his presentation style. Dave Chappelle takes his ability to tell stories and also his ability to talk about important matters and wraps it up in an amazing presentation manner. Let me give you an example of one of his favorite stories that I know of. He tells of the time he first bought a gun. He says that he had moved to a farm in rural Ohio. And one day while he was seated at his porch, he saw a man, he saw a white man, he saw a white man carrying a gun over his shoulder, walking nonchalantly across his property. He was extremely angry. And so he says that he ran to the supermarket immediately to buy a gun and then goes through the process of buying that gun. When he tells you of his outrage as he saw someone trespassing on his property, you could feel it. When he tells you of how out of breath he was when he got to the supermarket because he was running and he was in a rush and he was excited, you can feel it. When he tells you of the excitement of having that gun at the end, you can feel it. Using his voice, he transports you to the very time and place of those events happening. Before I took on the Engaging with Humor path, I was struggling with vocal variation. I still struggle. However, through the process of delivering the speeches in this path, I have made some progress. And how have I made this progress? I learned that the reason that most of the time I was monotone is because I had no emotional engagement with the topics that I was addressing. Let me give you an example. Take, for example, two of your friends go to a wedding. And then when they come back, you ask them how they found the wedding to be. One of them might be a matter of fact person, and they tell you about everything that happened in 1 or 2 minutes. However, the other might be more excited. They might take up to 20 minutes vividly describing every single detail of that event and every single detail of the bride and groom and other people that were involved in that marriage, in that wedding. What is the difference between these two people? The difference is that one of them when they look back to that event, they have an emotional connection to it. They feel something about everything that they are talking about. The other person does not feel anything about what they are talking about. And this is the same when I am delivering a speech. When I or you are delivering a speech, I like to take time to get an emotional connection with the subject these days. I think about how do I feel about the main topics? How do I feel about the introduction, the conclusion? How do I feel about the specific purpose in my speech? And by trying to get that emotional connection to the topic that I'm addressing, I'm able to express it in my voice and the audience is able to perceive it. Let me conclude. As I set out on this path of engaging with humor, I wanted to be interesting like Dave Chappelle, and I learned how to. I learned how to be interesting through storytelling, specifically through using the story structure consistently. I learned how to be interesting by talking about important things, but in a way that is not offensive. And this is by making it personal and talking about my personal experiences. I learned how to be interesting by improving my delivery. And I did this by practicing how to get an emotional connection to the subject matter that I'm addressing. If you want to be an interesting presenter, consider taking up the engaging with humor path. And in closing, remember the advice that Dave Chappelle gave Will. When you stand in front of people, you do not need to always be funny, but you must be interesting. Back to you, Madam Toastmaster.